When a man has no one but God, something powerful begins to happen. Let me ask you this. What do you do when the phone stops ringing? When the people who once celebrated you suddenly disappear? And when the ground under your feet starts to shake? What if I told you that these are not signs of your downfall, but signs that God is about to lift you into something greater? My friend, the most defining moments in a man's life are not when he is surrounded by the crowd, but when he is standing alone with God. And I have seen it. I have walked through it. And I am here to tell you that when God is all you have, He becomes more than enough. I remember a season in my life when the cheers quieted and the spotlight moved on. The very people who once stood by my side stopped calling. I would stand in a room full of people and still feel completely alone. And in those moments, I started to realize something I had never understood when everything was going well. I had been leaning on the applause, the affirmations, the systems I built with my own hands. I had built a safety net made of human support, and I called it faith. But when God started to shake those things, when He began removing each crutch I used to lean on, I could feel the fear rise in me. I thought I was being punished. I thought I had done something wrong. But in truth, I was being trained. God was teaching me how to walk again, not by sight, not by circumstance, but by faith. Let me tell you something important. God does not remove your crutches to see you fall. He removes them so that you can finally walk in the strength He intended for you. Faith is not developed in comfort. It is forged in the fire, in the furnace of crisis. When all other options have been stripped away, Gideon stood in front of a massive army with only 300 men, and God told him that even that number was too many. Why? Because if the victory could be explained by human strength, then man would take the glory. But God wanted Gideon to know that it was His power, not numbers, that would bring the victory. And God wants the same for you as long as you have a backup plan, a friend to pull a favor, an account to fall back on. You will lean on them more than on God. And He knows that. So sometimes, in His mercy, He removes those props not to punish you, but to invite you into deeper trust. When I no longer had those voices telling me I was doing great, when the safety net was gone, I learned how to hear the only voice that really mattered. I learned to recognize the whisper of God in the silence. I learned that when man walks out, the Master steps in. Now listen closely. This may be your season of subtraction. You might feel like everything is being taken away from you. Relationships are breaking. The job is uncertain. Support is fading. But hear me. Subtraction is often the beginning of multiplication. When God strips you, He is not trying to leave you exposed. He is trying to reveal your source. The applause of man fades quickly, but the approval of God endures forever. I remember nights when I would sit alone, not knowing what tomorrow would bring. I felt the weight of questions pressing on my chest. Will anyone understand? Will anyone care? And right there, in the silence of those nights, something shifted. My prayers changed. They were no longer rehearsed words. They became cries from my spirit. I stopped asking God to bring people back. I started asking him to bring me closer, and he did. Not through noise, not through answers, but through presence, a peace that surpassed understanding, a strength I never knew I had. Faith is not the absence of fear. Faith is choosing to stand even when you feel afraid. It is saying, Lord, I do not see how, but I trust you. And you can only learn that kind of faith when your feet are no longer touching the bottom. When you are in the deep and God becomes your only lifeline, that is when faith speaks louder than fear. If you are in that place today, do not panic. Do not curse the silent. Do not run from the solitude. This is not your defeat. It is your preparation. God is not done with you. He is building something in you, something strong, something that will last. The world needs believers who do not crumble when the lights go out. The world needs people who can stand in the dark because they have learned to walk by the light of God alone. So if you have been stripped, it may be because God is about to strengthen you. If you have been left, it may be because He wants to lead you. If you feel like everything is falling apart, it may be that God is putting you back together in a new way. And if you have no one but God, you have more than enough to step into the life He has prepared for you. Hãy tự hỏi, nếu Chúa lấy đi mọi thứ bạn dựa vào, liệu bạn còn đứng vững? Bạn có thể sẽ không còn ai. Nhưng nếu bạn có Chúa, bạn đã có tất cả. Let me ask you something personal. Have you ever found yourself in a season where everything around you goes quiet? The invitations stop. The rooms feel colder. The days feel longer. You look around and suddenly realize you are no longer surrounded by people who once celebrated you. The noise is gone, and in its place silence. The kind of silence that echoes. If you have ever walked through that kind of solitude, you know it can shake you. But what if I told you that this season you are in is not an accident, but a divine strategy? What if I told you that God often chooses isolation not to punish you, but to prepare you? I want you to sit with this thought for a moment. There are some revelations too sacred to be delivered in the crowd. There are some assignments that cannot be shouted over the noise of popularity. Some of the most profound callings are whispered in stillness. God is not absent in the quiet. He is present in a different frequency. And that frequency becomes clear when every other voice fades. Moses did not hear God in the palace. He heard Him in the desert. Not after a few days, not after a few months, but after 40 long years tending sheep in the hidden places of the wilderness. And it was there, away from power, away from performance, that the bush caught fire and God called him by name. It was not until he was alone that he was finally ready to listen. Friend, what if the silence around you is actually a sacred space God has set aside just for you? What if the very absence you are struggling with is the environment heaven designed for your transformation? Gold is not refined by applause. It is shaped in fire. Identity is not confirmed by crowds. It is carved in the quiet. You may feel hidden, but what if you are actually being held? What if this season is not one of abandonment, but one of becoming? When I walked through my own wilderness seasons, I did not recognize it at first. I resisted it. I tried to fill the silence. I reached for familiar voices. I searched for distractions, but the more I tried to escape it, the more I realized that this stillness was intentional. God was not speaking less. He was inviting me to listen more deeply, and it changed everything. I stopped fighting the solitude. I started welcoming it as sacred. That shift, just that, turned silence into sanctuary. And it can do the same for you. You see, Jesus himself often withdrew to lonely places to pray. The Son of God, the Savior of the world, needed solitude to commune with the Father. If he needed it, how much more do we? It is in those lonely places that the masks fall away. The crowd cannot see you. The world is not watching. But heaven is. And heaven is preparing something in you that no platform could ever produce. Sometimes the place that looks like a prison is actually where purpose is being refined. Sometimes the cave is not a curse. It is a classroom. And I believe some of you reading this right now are in that exact place. You have been asking God to bring people back, to make the room louder, to fill the silence. But maybe, just maybe, God is not bringing you out of it yet because He is not done speaking in it. Maybe there is still something He wants to show you that can only be seen in the stillness. So I want to ask you, not just as a speaker, but as someone who has lived this, are you willing to see this season differently? Are you ready to receive what God is doing in your solitude? If your heart is even slightly stirred by what you are hearing, I want you to do something small, but powerful. Type, "I'm ready," in the comments. Or if that feels like too many words, just type the number 1. That's it. One simple declaration. Not for me, not for the algorithm, but as a moment between you and God saying, I may not understand it all, but I'm open. I may feel hidden, but I believe I'm being held. I may be in the quiet, but I know you are near. And when you comment, you are not just responding to a message. You are showing up in faith. And I want to tell you something from the bottom of my heart as someone pouring these words out across a screen. Your presence here means more than you know. You are not just a number or a view. You are someone God is speaking to right now. And when you let me know you're there, I know I'm not speaking alone. That's a gift. One I don't take for granted. Thank you. Truly, so the next time silence surrounds you, don't rush to fill it. Don't curse the cave. Step into it. Lean in. Let the quiet become your holy ground, because the God who shaped Moses in the desert and whispered to Elijah in the cave is still speaking today. And He may be waiting for you in the very stillness you've been trying to escape. Let me tell you something. I have seen over and over again in the lives of people who walk with God, there are moments when those closest to you begin to drift away. Friends grow distant. Partners turn silent. Relationships once filled with laughter and loyalty suddenly fade into unanswered texts and unexplained silence. And the natural instinct in those moments is to ask, what did I do wrong? But what if the question should be, what is God trying to do right? You see, sometimes it is not rejection, it is redirection. Sometimes it is not about losing people, it is about being repositioned for what lies ahead. God has a way of rearranging our relationships when He is ready to realign our lives. And if you are in a season where people have walked away, I need you to hear this with your heart. This is not the end of your story. This may be the very place where God steps in. Abraham was not given a destination. He was given a direction. God told him, Go to a land I will show you. Not, here is the map, or this is what it will look like. Just go. That's all. Obedience first, clarity later. Abraham had to leave everything familiar, his land, his family, his inheritance, not because he was cursed, but because he was chosen. That is how faith works. You move before you see, you let go before you understand, and often, the first thing God calls you to leave is not a place, but a person, someone you have grown attached to, someone who walked with you for a season, but now they can no longer go where God is calling you next. I met a young man once who told me how painful it was to lose a close friend during a critical season of his life. That friend was with him through the hardest battles. They had dreams together, prayed together, planned together, and then one day, the connection was gone. Cold, unexplained. And for months, he wrestled with the ache of that loss, thinking he had failed somehow. But one morning in prayer, he said he sensed God whisper, "You are trying to hold on to history while I am trying to bring you into destiny." That shook him. And it may be speaking to you right now, my friend. Not every person in your life is meant to walk with you forever. Some were assigned to your beginning, but not your becoming. Some people love the version of you they met, but cannot handle the version of you God is forming. And when they leave, it hurts. Yes, but it also creates space for clarity, space for surrender, space for God. There are relationships we idolize without knowing it, ties we cling to so tightly that they begin to compete with the voice of God. And so, out of mercy, He removes them not to punish us, but to prepare us. You might be in that very moment right now, feeling abandoned, misunderstood, watching people slowly fade from your life. I want to ask you something. Are you willing to trust that what is leaving your life might be making room for what God is sending? Are you open to believe that their absence is not a curse, but a sign that your calling is about to expand? You do not need the full picture. You do not need all the answers. You just need the faith to release what no longer belongs. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is to stop chasing what God is removing, to stop mourning what He has closed. Just like Samuel, when Saul was rejected as king, God said to him, "How long will you mourn for Saul, seeing I have rejected him?" That was a prophet crying over a man God had moved on from. And I believe many of us are like Samuel, weeping over what God has already called finished. What if you stopped crying over who left and started thanking God for what's next? I want you to pause here and consider something. Is there someone or something you have been holding on to that God is asking you to release? A relationship you know deep down is no longer aligned with the path ahead. If this is speaking to you, I want to ask you for something simple. Type 1 in the comments. That's it. One number, one act of agreement. Or say, "I'm ready." Not for me, not for anyone else watching, but as a moment between you and God. A moment that says, "Lord, I'm willing to let go so you can lead." And as I read those comments, it reminds me I'm not speaking into the void. It reminds me someone out there is listening, processing, leaning in. That matters to me more than I can say. Thank you for showing up. So if people are walking out of your life right now, let them go. If relationships are fading without explanation, bless them as they leave. If the circle is shrinking, lift your hands and say, God, you are enough. Because when man walks out, God walks in. He never subtracts unless he plans to multiply. He never allows loss unless he is preparing for life, and he will never remove someone without purpose. So walk on, Abraham. You may not know where you are going, but you know who is leading, and that is more than enough. There is a kind of pain that leaves no bruise but cuts deeper than any wound to the flesh. It is the pain of betrayal, not from strangers, but from those you trusted, from the ones who knew your dreams, held your laughter, shared your table. When betrayal comes from within your own house, it shakes the foundation of everything you thought was safe. But let me tell you something I learned by walking with the Lord and watching His hand through the pages of Scripture and the valleys of life. Sometimes the betrayal you think is breaking you is the very thing God is using to build you. Sometimes the pit they pushed you into is not a place of death, but the beginning of destiny. Joseph was not betrayed by his enemies. He was thrown into a pit by his own brothers, sold like a commodity by the very ones who shared his blood. That kind of wound does not heal with time. It heals only in the presence of God. Joseph had every reason to grow bitter, every right to stay angry. But something deeper was at work in him. Something heaven had planted long before he wore the coat or shared the dream. God saw not only the pit but the palace, not only the betrayal but the blessing, and through every painful turn, He was orchestrating a plan far bigger than the wound. I have spoken with people who have wept over betrayal from family, from friends, from leaders they trusted. And I have seen what happens when they allow that pain to harden them. Their hearts close. Their vision shrinks. They stop dreaming. But I have also seen others who, like Joseph, chose to see the pit not as a tomb, but as a passage. Not as an end, but a beginning. And when they brought that pain to God instead of hiding it or holding it, they found that the same hands that allowed the betrayal were also ready to shape their purpose through it. Joseph was sold into slavery, accused of crimes he did not commit, and forgotten in prison. But even there, God was present. He was preparing him, and in time, Joseph was lifted from the prison and placed in Pharaoh's court, not for revenge, but for redemption. When famine came, it was Joseph, not his brothers, who held the key to life. He did not use his position to punish, but to provide. He looked into the eyes of the very men who tried to erase him and said, "What you meant for evil, God meant for good." That kind of strength does not come from self. It comes from knowing you are held by something greater than pain. It comes from believing that God is still writing your story, even when others try to end your chapter. Let me speak plainly. Betrayal will find you. No life is untouched by it. But what you do with it will shape everything that comes next. You can feed it and let it grow into bitterness. Or you can bring it before the Lord and let Him turn it into blessing. The cross was not a surprise. Jesus was not caught off guard by Judas. He washed his feet knowing full well what was coming. He was kissed by the mouth that would sell him, and yet he never pulled away. Because even betrayal was part of the path to the resurrection. Some of the greatest assignments are born through broken fellowship. Some of the strongest anointings are poured through wounds. If you are in that place right now, feeling crushed under the weight of what someone did to you, do not give that pain the power to shape who you become. Let God take it. Let Him show you that the pit is not permanent, that the chains are not forever, that the silence is not abandonment but preparation. You are not where you are by accident, and you are not alone in it. The God who stood with Joseph in the prison stands with you now. The same God who lifted him in due time has not forgotten how to lift, but He is not just after the outward story. He is after your heart, your response, your trust. Can you look at the people who hurt you and still choose forgiveness? Can you stand in the place where you were broken and still declare the goodness of God? That is what Joseph did. That is what Christ did. And that is what you are being invited into. Greatness is never handed. It is carved, and often it is carved through betrayal. The deeper the wound, the more room there is for grace. The lower the pit, the higher the platform God can raise. Joseph did not waste his pain. He turned it into purpose. He did not hold on to offense. He opened his hands and let mercy flow, and in doing so, he stepped into something that could only be unlocked by surrender. So let me say this clearly. If you are carrying the weight of betrayal today, do not bury it. Do not dress it up and call it strength. Bring it to the cross. Bring it to the one who knows the sting of betrayal and yet still chose to love. He can take what was meant for evil and turn it for good. He can turn the wound into a wellspring. He can turn the pit into a place of preparation. And He can turn your tears into testimony. Let Him finish what man tried to ruin, because what starts in betrayal can end in blessing when it passes through the hands of God. There is something holy about silence. Not the awkward silence we try to fill in conversation, but the kind of stillness that reaches into your bones and slows everything down. Elijah knew that kind of silence. He had seen the fire fall from heaven. He had stood boldly before false prophets and watched God prove His power without question. But when the threat came, when Jezebel sent word that his life would be taken, he ran, not because he lacked faith, but because he was weary. He found himself alone in a cave, drained and distant. The prophet who once stood on mountaintops now hid in the shadows. And it was there, not in the fire, not in the wind, not in the earthquake, that God came near. He spoke in a whisper. That whisper was not weak. It was intentional. God could have shaken the cave with thunder. He could have sent flashes of light and trembling earth, but instead, He chose stillness, because He knew that Elijah did not need another spectacle. He needed presence. He needed intimacy. And sometimes, God waits until every other voice has faded before He speaks. Because if the room is full of noise, we cannot hear what He wants to say. He does not compete for attention. He waits for surrender. We live in a world that fears silence. The moment a pause enters the room, we reach for a screen, a notification, a song. We crave the next thing, and slowly, without noticing, We begin to lose our ability to hear the soft things, the gentle voice of God, the impression of His Spirit, the whisper that says, I am here, I am enough, and I have not left you. The world screams, but God whispers. That is why silence is not emptiness, it is invitation. I remember nights when I would kneel in prayer and hear nothing in return. I would sit still, waiting for some kind of answer, and the only response was stillness. At first, I thought maybe I was doing something wrong. Maybe I needed to pray louder or longer. But then I began to realize that God was not being distant. He was drawing me deeper. He was teaching me to listen not with my ears but with my heart, to lean in with faith, not feelings. That changed everything. Because when you stop measuring God's presence by emotional response, you start recognizing His voice in unexpected ways. The peace that settles in the room, the verse that suddenly comes alive, the moment your heart quiets and you sense that you are not alone, that is not coincidence. That is God, and often He chooses to reveal Himself in ways that require your stillness. Elijah expected God to move like before, big, loud, immediate. But this time, God shifted the pattern. He whispered to draw Elijah out of the cave, to call him not with force, but with nearness. That same voice still calls us today, but we cannot hear it if we refuse to sit still, if we rush through prayer, if we treat silence like a threat instead of a gift. There is a reason Jesus often withdrew to lonely places, not because He needed isolation, but because He craved communion in the stillness. He realigned with the Father in the quiet. He found strength for the next step. And if the Son of God needed those moments, why would we think we can live without them? You may be in a season right now where everything feels quiet. No clear answers, no dramatic breakthroughs, just silence. And it may tempt you to think that God is far away, but let me tell you, silence does not mean absence. It may mean that God is closer than you think, watching, waiting, whispering. And the question is not, is He speaking? The question is, are we still enough to hear Him? You do not need to chase the noise. You do not need to force emotion. You just need to be willing to sit long enough for your heart to settle. That is where the whisper lives. That is where the voice comes. And when it does, it brings clarity, direction, healing, not through volume, but through weight. A whisper from God carries more power than 1,000 shouts from the world. So do not rush through the silence. Do not run from the stillness. Step into it like Elijah. Come out of the cave, not because the earthquake shook you, not because the fire amazed you, but because the whisper called your name. And when you respond to that whisper, everything begins to change. Not always on the outside, but deep within, where it matters most, where only God can reach. There is something you must understand about rejection. It often carries the fingerprints of God, not because He delights in your pain, but because He sees the palace when all you see is the cave. David was anointed king long before he wore a crown. Samuel poured oil on his head while Saul still sat on the throne. And from that moment, David did not step into royal robes. He stepped into hiding, into wilderness, into waiting. The same God who chose him also allowed him to be chased. That is a truth many forget. Anointing does not always come with access. Sometimes it comes with isolation. David found himself in caves, not because he failed, but because he was being formed. The cave became his classroom. No courtly advisors, no audience, just shadows and stillness. And in that space, his soul was shaped. The one who killed giants now had to conquer silence. The one praised in songs now had to sing alone. And yet, those dark places did not define him. They refined him. That is what rejection can do when placed in God's hands. I have seen people crumble under rejection. They begin to question everything. Was I not good enough? Did I miss the call? Why would God allow this? But here is what I have learned. The absence of applause does not mean the absence of assignment. Just because no one sees your value does not mean it has disappeared. Sometimes God hides you on purpose, not to bury you, but to protect what He is building in you. I met a woman who had applied for position after position, and every door kept closing. She prayed, she fasted, she prepared, but nothing moved. She began to feel invisible, forgotten. Then one day, she stopped asking why the doors were closed and began asking what God was doing in the silence. That was the shift. She realized He was teaching her to lead without a title, to serve without recognition, to be faithful without being noticed. And when the right door finally opened, she walked through it with more wisdom and strength than any resume could have given her. The season of rejection became the foundation of readiness. David had the heart of a king long before he had the crown, but that heart was not shaped in parades. It was shaped in pressure. When you are in a cave season, it will feel like you have been forgotten, overlooked, misunderstood. But that is often the very place God chooses to meet you, not to crush you, but to carve something eternal in you. In the darkness, you learn to see Him. In the stillness, you learn to hear Him. And in the solitude, you learn who you really are. Do not confuse rejection by man with rejection by God. Saul may have shut the door, but God was still opening a future. The rejection from the palace did not cancel the promise. It confirmed the preparation. God will use the very people who push you away to push you forward. The stone the builders rejected became the cornerstone. That is not just a verse. That is a pattern. There will be moments when people no longer clap, when your name is not called, when someone else is chosen, and your heart will ache. That is normal. But what you do next will determine who you become. You can spend your energy chasing approval, or you can take that ache to God and let Him transform it. Rejection can either be the root of bitterness or the seed of greatness. The choice is yours. David could have grown bitter in those caves, but instead, he learned to worship without a crowd, to encourage himself when no one else did, to seek God not for a platform but for presence. That is where true authority is born, not from titles or praise, but from a heart that stays loyal when there is nothing to gain but God Himself. If you feel rejected right now, let me tell you something. You may not believe. You are not off course. You are not cast aside. You may be exactly where God needs you to be. The cave is not a punishment, it is a process. And when the time comes, you will emerge not only with a crown, but with the character to carry it. Do not fear the darkness. That is where stars are formed. Do not wait for man's confirmation. Trust in God's voice. Says you, He knows you. And He has not forgotten what He spoke over you, even when others walk away. The cave may be cold, but it is holy. Let Him finish His work in you, because what He is building in the dark will shine in the light. And when that day comes, the rejection will no longer feel like a wound. It will feel like the very tool He used to shape your destiny. There is a level of surrender that does not come through comfort. It only comes through collapse. It is not shaped in times of abundance, but in seasons of loss. Job was a man known for his integrity. He walked uprightly before God. He was blessed with family, wealth, reputation. Then, in a single sweep, all of it fell. His children died. His body broke down. His wealth vanished. Even the voice of his own wife urged him to give up. And in that moment of ruin, Job uttered words that have echoed through generation. Though He slay me, yet will I trust Him. That was not weakness speaking. That was faith stripped down to its bones. You see, true surrender is not the kind that whispers yes when all is going well. True surrender rises when everything falls, when the house is quiet, when the account is empty, when the future is uncertain. That is when faith stands tall, not in defiance, but in trust. Not because you understand, but because you believe. And belief at that depth cannot be faked. It is born when the scaffolding is gone and only the foundation remains. I have sat with people in hospitals, beside graves, in empty homes. I have seen tears that had no words behind them, and in those places, I have seen something else too. I have seen hearts that still turned toward God when nothing made sense. I have heard prayers that said, "Lord, I do not get this, but I am still yours." That is what God is looking for, not polished prayers, but surrendered hearts. Sometimes God allows everything to shake, not because He enjoys your pain, but because He wants you to see where your trust truly lives. Is your peace built on stability or on Him? Is your joy tied to outcomes or anchored in His presence? These are questions you cannot answer with theory, only through experience, only through storms. Job was not being punished. He was being proven. God already knew what was in him. The trial was not to inform God. It was to reveal the depth of faith within Job himself. And once Job laid down every right to understand and still chose to worship, heaven responded. God restored him, but the restoration was not just double in possessions. It was deeper in spirit. Job came out of the ashes with more than before, not just in wealth, but in wisdom. Not just in family, but in faith. You might be in that season right now where things are being stripped away, What once felt certain now feels fragile. What once brought security now brings silence. Do not waste this season. Do not rush out of it. Let it press you into God. Let it expose every place where your trust was misplaced. Let it draw you back to the only one who remains when all else fades. Surrender is not giving up. It is giving in. It is laying down the illusion of control and saying, Lord, even if I lose everything, you are still enough. That kind of faith does not rise in the spotlight. It rises in the shadows, in the broken places, in the quiet decisions to stay faithful when nothing in your world makes sense. God does not need what you have. He wants who you are. And sometimes He removes the things you lean on so that you can finally lean on Him. The loss is real. The grief is real. But so is the grace. And when your surrender comes from emptiness, heaven receives it with a weight this world cannot understand. I remember walking through a season where the lights went out in every direction. The plans failed. The support faded. I felt like I had nothing to offer. But it was in that emptiness that God began to speak, not in long sentences, sometimes only in stillness, but He was there, not because I did something right, but because I was finally quiet enough to see Him. And He began to rebuild something in me, not around comfort or reputation, but around His presence. That was where real peace began. So if you feel like you have lost too much, look again. You may be in the middle of a holy rebuilding, not with the materials of this world, but with the presence of the one who holds the world. Job's story did not end in suffering. It ended in glory, but the glory came through surrender. And that is the invitation still standing today, not to explain your pain, but to trust through it, not to understand everything, but to hold fast to the one who does. God is not finished, and neither are you. Let the loss press you deeper. Let the silence teach you to listen. Let the brokenness become your altar. Because when everything else is gone and you still choose Him, you will find that you never truly lost. You were only being brought back to what matters most. When the crowd disappears and the lights go dim, when the applause fades and the voices grow silent, when your strength runs out and no one picks up the phone, that is not the end. That is the atmosphere where miracles begin. Jesus did not begin His ministry in the courts of Jerusalem or among the religious elite. The Holy Spirit led Him into the wilderness, not into comfort, but into confrontation. Not into a platform, but into preparation. And it was there, in the barren stillness of the desert, that something sacred happened. Temptation came. Isolation came. Hunger came. But so did power. When Jesus walked out of the wilderness, He returned in the power of the Spirit. That is no coincidence. That is a blueprint. You may be standing in a season right now that feels like wilderness. No support, no spotlight, no certainty, just you and the weight of your questions. But what if I told you that this is the very place God chooses to birth the extraordinary, not when everything is in place, but when everything feels like it is falling apart? Because in the wilderness, you stop performing. In the wilderness, you stop pretending. You stop depending on others to validate your calling. And you begin to discover that God is not a supplement to your strength. He is your source. This is where real faith comes alive. Not in the crowd, but in the cave. Not in the noise, but in the stillness. Not in the feast, but in the fast. When all you have is God, you begin to realize He is all you need, not as a saying, not as a sermon, but as a lived reality. When the resources dry up, when the answers run thin, when the people walk away, what remains is presence. And presence changes everything. I have met people who encountered God not in the sanctuary but in the hospital, not in the boardroom but in the bedroom, with tears on the pillow. Not when life was working, but when it was crumbling. And it was in those hidden places that the power of God became undeniable. Miracles are not always loud. Sometimes they begin with a whisper in a prayer that no one else hears. Sometimes they start when a soul on the edge whispers one word with trembling lips, "Help," and heaven answers. When man walks out, heaven walks in. When doors close, the gate of God opens wide, but it only opens to those who stop knocking on the wrong doors, those who stop begging for validation from people who were never assigned to their future, those who finally lift their eyes from the emptiness around them and say, "Lord, if you are all I have, then I trust you to be enough." That is where miracles begin. That is where breakthrough is born. I remember walking through a season where every familiar support system had vanished. People I depended on became distant. Plans I trusted collapsed. I was left with silence and uncertainty. But in that emptiness, I found clarity, not because God gave me a map, but because He gave me Himself. And that was better than a map. That was presence. That was the pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. That was daily bread, not monthly plans. That was grace for today, not explanations for tomorrow. And I learned something. I learned that strength is not the absence of struggle. It is the presence of surrender. I learned that power is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet confidence that says, "I do not know what is next, but I know who goes with me." I do not need a crowd to believe. I need the Christ who stood in the wilderness and walked out in power. You do not need everyone to understand your calling. You do not need perfect conditions to step into purpose. You need one thing. You need the presence of God. And when you have that, you lack nothing. He is water in the desert. He is manna in the wilderness. He is the rock that follows you, the fire that leads you, the cloud that covers you. He is enough. So if today you feel like no one sees you, no one calls, no one notices what you are carrying, you are in good company. That is the place where prophets are formed. That is the space where callings are refined. That is where God says, "Come away with me, and I will show you what no man can." Do not despise this quiet season. It is not a punishment. It is preparation. What if you stopped asking God to end the wilderness and started asking Him what He is building in it? What if the miracle is not something coming to you, but something being formed inside you? What if the breakthrough is not out there, but already rising in your spirit, in your thoughts, in your tears, in your prayers? The world looks for miracles in stages and stadiums, but God often begins them in silence, in hidden corners, in personal caves, in whispered prayers at midnight. That is the story of Jesus. That is the story of David. That is the story of Elijah. And that can be your story too. So lean in, do not run, do not rush to escape the solitude. Receive it. Let it refine you. Let it strip you of every false support. Let it lead you to the one who never fails. And when you walk out of this season, you will not come out empty. You will come out carrying power, not borrowed, not imitated, but born in the place where you had no one but God. That is the miracle. That is the real blessing. That is what turns wilderness into holy ground. And when He brings you into the next chapter, you will know it was not the applause of man that got you there. It was the whisper of God in the desert that called you forward. That is where the real story begins. And if this spoke to your heart, get ready, because the next video is not just another message. It is the continuation of what God is building in you. So keep watching. He is not finished. Not with the story, and not with you,